There is a particular kind of silence that falls on the land when it has stopped expecting rain. Not the silence of rest, not the silence of evening settling in of cattle, finding their place and the last bird tucking beneath a post. This is a different kind. This is the silence of resignation, of a thing that has endured as long as it intends to endure and has begun very quietly to let go. In the summer of 1905, the high plains of the Texas Panhandle had been wearing that silence for 14 months. The Llano Estacado, the staked plain, old-timers called it a country so flat and so vast that early travelers drove stakes into the earth just to find their way back, had gone to dust. The buffalo grass was gray and brittle as old paper. The draws that in wet years held a foot of dark water were now pale cracks, ribbed and open like the hands of a man who has worked too long without rest. The windmills turned in the hot wind, but brought nothing up. They made a sound like rusted hinges. Nobody fixed them. What was the point? On the Crow Ranch 30 miles east of Amarillo, along a road that was more idea than fact, the cattle stood at the fence in the late afternoon heat and stared at the empty trough with the patient dim faith of animals that do not know how to stop hoping. Their hip bones made shadows on the ground. 12 had gone down in the past 3 weeks. The foreman had a hand drag them out past the far pasture so the others wouldn't have to look. This was the Crow Ranch in August of 1905. That was the state of things. That was when a young man walked in off the road carrying nothing but a canvas pack and a silence the other men could not quite read. What none of them knew, what none of them thought to ask, was that the thing in that pack was not nothing at all. It was a knowledge 3 generations old, passed down through 2 women who were never once allowed to say it out loud. This is their story too. If you've been here before, you know what we do in this place. We slow down, we settle in, we listen. If tonight is your first time with us, we're glad to have you. There's a subscribe button somewhere on your screen. Press it, and we'll be here every time you need a quiet place to rest. Now, let's begin. The bunkhouse cistern was working on its last 8 inches. Tatum Briggs, the ranch foreman, walked to it every morning before the sun got serious and measured what remained with a stick he'd marked in careful lines. He wrote the number in the back of his account ledger, and he did not show it to anyone. You could only watch the number go down and decide not to let it decide everything. Berta the cook had stopped making soup 2 weeks before. Soup required a generosity with water that the ranch no longer had. She made biscuits and salt pork and coffee with the grounds reused once. Nobody complained. Complaining required a certain expectation of better, and better was not something people were counting on. The windmill pump at the north tank had seized. Chet Falk was supposed to have climbed up and freed it 3 weeks back. He hadn't. The mechanism now sat jammed with rust and fine grit, and the dried body of a horned lizard that had gotten in between the gears, which struck Chet as somebody else's problem. Into all of this walked Silas Rook. He came from the south, which was the direction of nowhere useful, and he was on foot, which told you something about his circumstances. He had a canvas pack over one shoulder, worn enough that the stitching had let go in 2 places and been resewn with a different thread. He wore a shirt the color the sky gets just before dark, faded to almost nothing. His boots had seen more country than they'd been designed for. He was 26 years old, though he looked older in the way that men who've spent years under the open sky tend to look older. He had hands that were the hands of someone who had worked outside since he was old enough to be useful. He stopped at the gate and looked at the ranch before he opened it. Not the way a man looks at something he wants, the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand. His eyes moved across the yard, up to the windmill, across the fence line, to the cattle. He didn't say anything, he just looked. Then he opened the gate. Tatum Briggs saw him from the barn doorway. Briggs was a compact, deliberate man with the kind of face that gave nothing away until it decided to. He had worked for Hadley Crowe for 11 years, and he had the habits of someone accustomed to watching things closely and saying less about them than he knew. He watched the stranger come up the path, and he read him the way he read weather, not deciding anything yet, just collecting. Chet Fulk saw him from the fence, where he was doing the job he did near any fence, which was leaning against it. "Well now," Chet said to Roy Doss, who was coiling rope a few feet off. Roy didn't look up. He kept working the rope. That was Roy Doss' entire man, who assigned very little importance to most things and showed it by simply not turning toward them. The stranger came to the yard and stopped. Briggs walked out to meet him. Silas Rook. He didn't offer his hand, just the name, the way a man offers information rather than introduction. "Looking for work." Briggs looked at him a moment. "Droughts run off most of the hands we had." "I know, looking for work anyway." That was not the answer Briggs had been expecting. He considered it for 2 seconds. "Bert'll feed you. Cisterns near dry, you'll haul what's left to the troughs morning and afternoon. $1 a week and a bunk." "That'll do." Chet Fulk laughed from the fence, the kind of laugh that was also a commentary. $1 a week for a man willing to work a dying ranch in August. He said it to no one in particular, which was the way Chet said most things. Well, somebody's got no better options. Silas did not respond. He set his pack against the base of the bunkhouse wall, where it would be out of the way. The first afternoon he hauled. The cistern was behind the main house, half sunk in the ground, covered with a sheet of corrugated tin, weighted with a flat rock to keep out the dust. He lifted the rock and the tin and looked at what was in there. 8 inches of water with a skin of red grit on the surface. He used the long-handled dipper and filled the first bucket, then the second. He carried them on a wooden yoke across his shoulders to the nearest trough, poured them in, and watched the cattle press each other aside to get at the thin film before it sank into the cracked planks. Then he walked back and did it again. It was the kind of work that newcomers always got. It carried no standing and required nothing but a back and 2 arms and the willingness to keep doing it. Berta stood in the cookhouse doorway and watched him make 2 trips. Then she went inside. On the 3rd trip, Chet appeared at the cistern wall with his arms crossed. "Where you coming from?" "South." "South covers a lot of ground." "It does." Chet tried another angle. "You got people had." That particular past tense ended conversations. It ended this one. Chet pushed off the wall and wandered away. Silas filled his buckets and went back to the trough. What Chet could not have known, what none of them knew, was that Silas Rook was not in those trips between cistern and trough thinking about the water in the cistern or the water in the trough or how long either had left. He was thinking about the ground. He could not help it. It was not a choice. It was the way his attention organized itself on new land, a sorting, a slow reading, the way some people hear pitch or read a page of print. He'd had it since childhood, and he'd been taught to trust it, and in the years since of trying to earn his keep across the dry parts of the southwest, he had also been taught that most people had no interest in hearing about it. So he looked quietly. The north pasture, where he could see the survey stakes from the trough path, where the men had apparently been planning to sink their next well, was a problem. The ground swelled there in a subtle way, barely visible unless you knew what you were looking for. Where ground-swelled bedrock ran shallow. You could dig 30 feet in ground like that and bring up nothing but limestone chips and the patience of whoever held the handles. But about 200 yards further near the south fence line, there was an old cottonwood. Half dead, maybe. Its upper limbs were stripped and gray-dried back by 2 years of hard weather, but the lower half was green, defiant green, almost aggressive, the kind of green that had no business being there, given what the summer had done to everything else. Something had its roots in water, something deep and slow. Silas set his buckets down in the shade of the barn and looked at that cottonwood. He looked at the way the buffalo grass ran thin and ashen in every direction, except for a narrow strip between the south fence and the tree where it was slightly, almost imperceptibly darker. The difference between soil that is dry all the way to nothing and soil that has the memory of moisture somewhere below. He picked up his buckets and kept walking. As he turned the corner of the barn, a scissor-tailed flycatcher came off the fence rail, that long forked tail catching the light as it lifted white and pale rose, splitting the air behind it, and it flew a slow arc toward the south fence and the cottonwood, and then up, and was gone. He watched it go. Get very quiet, his grandmother had told him years back, and the ground will tell you. He went back to his hauling. The next morning the hands gathered in the shadow of the water tank to argue about where to dig. There were 4 of them besides Briggs Chetfulk, Roy Doss, and 2 others, Hale and Purvis, who had been on the Crow place long enough to have opinions about everything and enough standing to voice them. They were back and forth about the north pasture, where some man in Amarillo had apparently told Crow the formation ran different. Silas had been carrying a bucket past the group. He stopped. He should not have. A man on his second day, carrying no history and no credibility, had no business walking into a conversation like that. He knew all of that. He stopped anyway. The north pasture won't work. His voice was level, not challenging, just stating, "Rock's too close to the surface up there, but the south fence line near the cottonwood that's still got green in its lower half, the ground runs different along there. Something's got roots in water, not deep, maybe 25 feet, maybe less." The silence was complete. Chet looked at him, then Chet laughed the same laugh as before, but sharper now. "Listen to the new man. Walk in off the road yesterday, now you're going to tell us where to sink our well." He spread his hands for the others. "What are you, some kind of water witch?" Roy Doss said nothing. He picked up his rope and walked away. Not angrily, just away. The way a man walks from something that isn't worth the energy of even a dismissal. Hully and Purvis exchanged a look that Silas had seen before. The look that isn't quite contempt but is deciding whether to become it. He didn't push. He picked up his bucket and kept walking. Behind him he heard Chet say something he didn't catch, and then the low sound of 2 men laughing, and then they went back to arguing about the north pasture. That night, after the others were asleep, Silas sat on the edge of his bunk and opened his pack. He moved quietly. He reached past the folded shirt and the spare socks and the oilskin to the thing at the bottom, wrapped in a length of worn cotton cloth tied with a cord. He untied the cord and unwrapped the cloth. The forked willow rod was not much to look at. 8 inches from the base fork to where it divided into 2 prongs, each prong maybe 15 inches long, the whole thing smooth and pale with years of handling. Augusta had cut it herself from a willow along Palo Duro Creek when Silas was 6 years old, and she had given it to him the winter before she died. "You won't need it as a crutch," she had told him. "You rid the land fine without it. But there'll be days you need to remember who taught you. On those days, you hold this." He held it now. He ran his thumb along the fork the way he always did, and he thought about Augusta. Augusta Rook had been born in 1843 on the eastern edge of the Panhandle country, into a world where the land was everything, and the sky ran it all, and water was the mercy that separated the living from the dead. She'd found her gift young. She did not call it a gift. She called it reading, as if the ground were a language she happened to have been born speaking. She could not explain how she knew. She knew the way she knew when a storm was building before the clouds showed the way. She knew which calf would not make the week. The ground spoke, and she listened. She did not advertise this. She waited to be asked. They always asked eventually. The men who talked over her at the table, who made the decisions about where to run the fence and where to build the barn, and where always to sink a well, when those decisions came up empty, they came to her. But they came at night. They sent a boy to knock at her back door after dark, and she pulled on her boots and walked out with them to whatever failing enterprise needed her attention, and she found what she found, and in the morning nobody mentioned it. "It's women's work," she'd hear them say more than once in the daylight hours. The witching rod, some trick of the superstitious, and then they drank the water she'd found. She took Silas to the fields when he was 5, and then 6, and then 7. She showed him how to read the ants when heat bore down. They moved their eggs toward cool, and cool was always near water. She showed him how to find the tree that still held color at its base when its neighbors had surrendered, because that tree had its roots in something the others didn't reach. She showed him how to break a handful of earth and bring it to his nose. Living soil smelled of itself organic, and close like something that breathed. Dead soil smelled of nothing or of chalk. She pressed the rod into his hands one long afternoon and stood behind him with her hands steadying his. "Some people say it moves when you get close," she told him. "Some say that's superstition. I won't tell you which is right. What I'll tell you is this: when you hold it, you have to stop talking. You have to stop thinking about what you need the answer to be. Get very quiet, and the ground will tell you. You ask for what it has, not what you want it to have, what it has." He was 7 years old. He remembered the weight of the rod in his hands, the afternoon light on the back of his neck, the smell of warm grass and red earth. "One more thing," she said. "The day you let pride do the reading instead of the ground, that's the day you get it wrong. Getting it wrong in this work doesn't only cost you your pride, it costs you the thing you were looking for." He hadn't understood that, not then. He was 7. He was thinking about the weight of the rod in his hands. He understood it now. 3 days after Silas had spoken and been waved off, Hadley Crow rode in from town. Crow was 56 years old and had been on the Panhandle his entire adult life, and wore it in the way he carried himself, a permanent set against wind, a squint that never fully left even indoors, a jaw held at an angle that had started as stubbornness and hardened over decades into something closer to certainty. He was not a cruel man, not exactly. He was a man who had been right about enough things in enough circumstances that the idea of being wrong had never found a place to sit down in him. He rode in at midday and found the hands gathered in the yard still circling the well, question which had gotten worse in his absence. The cistern had dropped another 2 inches. Chet Falk, faithful to his nature, had apparently resurrected the story of the new hand who claimed to know where the water was, and was doing it loudly enough that Crow, still mounted, caught the shape of it from 20 feet away. "Which one?" Crow said. Chet pointed. Silas was carrying a bucket. He set it down when Crow rode toward him. He looked up at the man on the horse without shifting his weight, without stepping back. "You said you knew where the water was." "I said the south fence line, the cottonwood that's still got green in its bottom half. Something's got roots in water down there, not deep." Crow looked toward the south fence. He looked back at Silas. He took in the worn boots, the canvas pack, the particular stillness of a man who had been dismissed already and was not pretending otherwise. He laughed. It was not a small laugh. It was the kind that collected other people around it. And it did. Chet started in. Hale and Purvis turned. Bertha appeared in the cookhouse doorway. Roy Doss, for the first time, actually looked up. "A man walks in off the road," Crow said, loud enough for all of them, spreading one hand toward Silas in a gesture of theatrical presentation, carrying nothing. "Inside of 3 days, he's going to show me where the water is on land I've worked for 30 years. He looked at his hands, then back at the crew. 3 decades I've been here. 3 generations of men on this ground, and this fellow is going to set us all straight." The laughter that came back to him was the laughter of people who needed something to laugh at. The drought had pressed them, and the heat had pressed them, and the slow arithmetic of the cistern, dropping 1 inch at a time, had pressed them, and here was something simple and satisfying to laugh at. Chet laughed the loudest, and with the most pleasure. Even Bertha smiled, though she turned away before it could be seen properly. Roy Doss did not laugh. He watched. Silas waited for it to finish. "I'm not pretending to teach you anything," he said. "I'm telling you what the land is saying. You can hear it or not." Something changed in Crow's expression, not anger, something more deliberate than anger. He looked at Silas for a long moment, long enough that Chet's laughter tapered into uncertainty, long enough that Tatum Briggs took 1 slow step forward from the barn doorway. "All right," Crow said. He said it the way a man says the opening word of a sentence that has already been entirely decided. He straightened in the saddle and let his voice carry to the edges of the yard. "Everybody standing here is a witness to this. If the spot this man points to brings up real water enough to matter, he stays on this ranch not as a hired hand. He stays with a voice in how this place is run, a voice heard the same as any man's." He paused, letting it sit. "But if he digs and finds nothing, he walks off this property on foot the same way he walked on, and I don't want to hear his name mentioned on this road again." The yard went completely still. Chet Falk's grin had spread wide and locked. This was better than he'd hoped for. Roy Doss was watching with the quality of attention that meant he was actually paying attention. Crow looked back down at Silas. "You have until noon tomorrow. Dig where you like." He leaned back in the saddle. "We'll all see what you find." He dismounted and walked to the house, and the door closed behind him, and it was done. Silas stood in the yard after the others drifted off, and he thought about his mother. Lavinia Rook had been 31 when she was called to a ranch 3 counties over, a dry summer. Not unlike this one, the well caved in, and the creek running a trickle of brown water that was more silt than anything useful. The rancher had heard about her. the way people heard about Augusta indirectly, carefully through the back route of reluctant acknowledgement by way of a cousin who'd seen it work and would only say so after enough whiskey dissolved his careful silence about things connected to women and what women knew. She had walked the ground alone. She'd found two candidates, one near the flat rocks at the east edge of the dry creek bed, where a thin seam of caliche had a crack along it that breathed slightly cooler air on fall evenings. The other in the open pasture, where the grass had no business being the color it was, and yet was. She'd chosen the flat rocks. The indicators were sound, the moisture seam, the grass species shifting at exactly the line where water touched roots from below, she'd told the foreman. The foreman had looked at her the way Chet Falk had looked at Silas, the way a man looks at something he has already decided isn't worth adjusting his view for. He dug 100 paces away from where she'd pointed. He dug for 4 days. He brought up white rock and the dwindling patience of his crew, and nothing else. At the end of the 4th day, they went to the flat rocks where Lavinia had said to dig. The water came at 22 feet, clear and cold, more of it than the crew had seen in months. She was paid $3 and shown to the side door of the ranch house, the kitchen garden door, the door that opened for people who weren't quite guests. The rancher took the credit. The foreman told the story for years, as though some instinct of his own had finally led him to the right spot. Nobody corrected him. Lavinia had told Silas that story on a fall evening beside the stove, and she had not told it with bitterness exactly, though he could see what it cost her to tell it without bitterness. "What a poor woman knows," she said, smoothing her hands along her skirt in the way she did when she was deciding how to say something, "is worth gold. But they pay you in silence." She looked at the stove. "You carry the same knowing I carry, and your grandmother carried before me. You'll be heard in ways we couldn't be. Use it right. Don't use it small. Don't use it small." He stood in the wind of the crow yard and let that sit in him. The cattle moved along the fence in the slow, patient effort to find shade that didn't exist. The windmill turned against a blank sky. He walked the ranch that afternoon, all of it. He didn't carry the willow rod openly. He held it down the leg of his trousers with one hand in a way that looked like a man with a hand in his pocket, which was exactly what it looked like. Augusta had been clear. It wasn't a crutch, and it wasn't a trick. It was a reminder to stop talking inside his own head, to ask for what the ground had. He walked the north pasture first and confirmed what he'd already read. The bedrock shelf was maybe 15 feet down, and between here and it there was nothing useful. He walked the middle section near the old corral. This was more interesting. There was a quality he'd learned to register through the soles of his boots on certain kinds of ground, a faint thermal difference, as if the earth breathed a half-degree cooler here than 15 feet in any other direction. The grass was still sere and brittle, but there were 2 or 3 places where it was a shade thicker, a color the width of a finger above the surrounding brown. It wasn't much. He stood there for a while, then he kept walking. The south fence, the cottonwood. He pushed through dry grass to the tree and crouched at its base. The bark at the roots was still smooth, still living. He pressed his palm flat against the earth where the root system spread out, and he held very still. What he felt, he had never been able to describe this in a way that satisfied anyone, including himself, was not movement. It was the absence of one kind of quiet and the presence of another. A depth below this ground that the north pasture and the corral section did not have. Something down there that was still and present and patient. He looked up. The scissor-tailed flycatcher was back. It had settled on the second lowest branch of the cottonwood, and it looked down at him with one bright black eye, its head tilted. That long forked tail hung below the branch in the windless afternoon, absolutely still split at its tip, like a letter written in two directions at once. He stayed crouched and held its gaze. Then he stood up. He walked back across the dry ground toward the corral. Slowly, the forked willow rod, now uncovered, hanging at his side in his right hand. He stopped at the place near the corral where the grass had been marginally, almost not there, greener. He looked at the ground. He looked at the corral gate 20 feet away. He looked at the main house. He looked at the bunkhouse. He thought about what noon tomorrow would look like. Crow on horseback, probably. The neighbors he'd likely invite, because a man like Crow would want witnesses to a good story. Chet Falk running his mouth. Roy Doss watching for once. Nell Crow, he'd seen her briefly that morning coming out of the barn with a serious face and no patience for whatever Chet had been saying, probably there as well. He thought about what it would feel like to be proven right in front of all of them, close enough to see their faces when the water came. He looked back toward the south fence. The cottonwood 200 yards off. The bird already gone. The ground at the corral was not nothing. He was honest about that. Something was there, not as clear, not as deep, not as certain, but something. If he pressed it long enough, he might get a trickle that would be enough to say he hadn't entirely failed. Or he might find the real vein at an angle he hadn't mapped from the surface. Things in the ground didn't always behave the way they read. That was the story he told himself. He stood there in the flat afternoon light, and he heard very faintly the cottonwood leaves shifting in a breath of wind too small to feel on his skin, a sound like people who know each other well enough to say the difficult things speaking very quietly among themselves. His grandmother had said, "The day you let pride do the reading is the day you get it wrong." He looked at the corral. He thought, "I want them to see it. I want to be standing right here." He picked up the spade. He drove it into the earth at the edge of the corral. The sound it made was the sound of a door closing on the right answer, though he would not understand it that way until much later. For now the dry earth gave under the iron, and the work began, and the long, wrong road opened quietly under his feet. The afternoon went against him from the first hour. The earth near the corral gave under the spade well enough. The top foot was loose and cracked, and came away in dry chunks, and for a little while that deceived him. Easy ground could mean many things. It could mean the subsoil was porous, which was what you wanted for water to collect. It could mean the land had been worked or disturbed here before. It meant neither. At 18 inches, the spade hit something dense and pale. Caliche. The hardened calcium layer that ran under much of the panhandle, like a second indifferent ceiling, not quite bedrock, but close enough in terms of what it meant for a man trying to find water. Caliche held nothing. It shed nothing. Water didn't move through it the way you needed it to move. He kept going. You could get through caliche. Sometimes it ran thin, and a good iron could make progress. He shifted to the pick and swung it level, and the sound it made was wrong, a tight, dense report with no resonance. The soil below the caliche line didn't want to break. It didn't crumble. It shattered into irregular plates and came up dry all the way through. Chet Falk had pulled a fence post out and was sitting on it in the shade of the corral gate, approximately 8 feet away. "How's it going down there?" Not a question. Silas kept swinging. "Might want to dig a bit faster. Noon tomorrow has a way of coming around. Chet watched. Let us know when you hit the ocean. He paused, looked over at Hale and Purvis, working the fence line close enough to hear. Purvis smiled. Hale went back to his wire. The work was its own argument. When you drove a pick into good ground, even dry ground with water underneath, there was a sound you learned over time. A slightly lower register, an undertone that said the earth here was not solid all the way down. Good digging had a quality of cooperation the soil gave in pieces that suggested it had wanted to come loose. This ground didn't cooperate. It came up in the kind of pieces that told you it had always intended to stay exactly where it was. By mid-afternoon, the hole was armpit deep. Silas pulled himself out and sat on the edge with his feet in it and drank the last of his water and looked at what he'd done. Below his boots, the bottom showed white with pulverized caliche and a thin skim of mud, barely enough to wet the center, barely enough to call moisture. If he pressed his palm flat against it, it came away with a trace of gray damp. That was all. Not a seep, not a vein, not a sign that anything below had any intention of rising. His hands had blistered and broken through the handles of the pick and spade, dark where he'd gripped them. His lower back had its own concerns. The sun sat on the back of his neck with the intimate, punishing patience of the desert in August. "There it is," Chet said from his post. He spread one hand toward the hole, like a man presenting something of modest value. "All that wisdom." Silas said nothing. He looked at the far tree line. He knew without turning exactly where the cottonwood stood. He could have pointed to it with his eyes closed. He had been not looking at it for 3 hours. The sun went down. The men ate, and the conversation at dinner was of the studied variety, everyone agreeing not to discuss what everyone was thinking about. Berta set biscuits down without looking at him. Nobody asked him anything, nobody offered anything either, which was a different and more considered kind of cruelty than what Chet practiced and left less to hold on to. He ate. He went to the bunk. He lay there with the sounds of the other men settling into sleep around him, the long exhalation, the settling back of someone who has reached the end of a day's requirement, and he looked at the ceiling boards and thought about all of it with the unsleeping honesty that only comes past midnight when the part of a person that constructs favorable explanations has finally run out of energy. The ground near the corral had not been lying. It had said what it had to say, and he had chosen to hear what he needed it to say. That was different. Those were different things, and he knew it, and had known it from the moment the spade beat down, and had driven the pick anyway. He had wanted to stand right there, in that yard, close enough to watch their expressions change. His grandmother had been exact about this. He found a willow rod in his pack in the dark without taking it out, his thumb moving along the fork the way it always did, finding the place where it divided, the split at the tip. How a thing opens in 2 directions at once. Don't ask for what you want it to have, ask for what it has. He'd broken the rule so cleanly and so deliberately that calling it a mistake felt like a form of charity he hadn't earned. The faint gray of moonlight found a gap in the roof boards. He watched it and did not sleep, and thought about his mother walking the ranch 3 counties over, following 2 choices down to the right, one pointing at the flat rocks, being redirected 100 paces away by a man whose primary qualification had been that he was standing there with authority and the absolute conviction that he knew better. She had pointed right. She had been moved aside. She had ended up right anyway, and been paid in coins and a side door. He, by contrast, had pointed wrong, had known he was pointing wrong, had pointed there anyway, because standing in that particular spot, in front of those particular people, had felt for one shallow and disqualifying moment like it mattered more than the truth of the thing. The irony of it sat in him like a stone. He was still awake when the moon had moved considerably further across the sky, and the bunkhouse had gone as quiet as it was going to get. He heard the step, one man unhurried with the natural evenness of someone who has learned to move through the world without waking it. Then the soft close of the bunkhouse door, and he got up. Tatum Briggs was sitting on the low rail at the edge of the yard, with his forearms on his knees and his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. He didn't look up when Silas came out, but he left room on the rail. They sat with no particular hurry to begin. The sky over the panhandle at that hour was the kind of thing that cost words. It went so deep and held so much that the appropriate response was silence, which they gave it. "You stopped at the cottonwood," Tatum said eventually, "longer than you stopped anywhere else." Silas didn't answer that. People only stay that long where they actually believe. He turned his hat once more. Then you walked away and dug near the corral. Still Silas said nothing. Tatum studied the moon's position with the patience of a man who measures time by something other than clocks. "I grew up watching my mother be moved away from what she knew." He stopped, resumed. "She was a midwife. More than that, she knew fevers, knew the body, in a way the doctor in town would have needed 4 more years of school to catch up to. She pulled through cases he'd given up on." A breath. He called her a root woman to her face, after a patient she'd saved had already thanked him, not her. Said it like that closed the matter. The night held that for a moment. She never walked away from a call, no matter the hour. He did sometimes when the money wasn't right. She never once did. He set his hat on his knee. She saved his practice more times than he knew and never told him. "I watched that for 20 years and I thought I understood it. Then I got old enough to realize I did not really." Silas looked toward the south fence, the faint dark edge of the cottonwood against the stars. "I dug where I'd be seen." He said it plainly without anything around it. "Not where she told me." Tatum nodded once slowly, like a man who'd known this and had been waiting for Silas to arrive at it himself. "You've got until noon." "Not enough time. Not with what I've got left in me tonight." "No." Tatum stood unhurried. "Not alone, you don't." He picked up the hat. "I'll carry the pick." They didn't talk on the walk across. The earth changed under Silas's boots inside the last 50 yards, in a way. He felt before he consciously registered it. A fractional gave a slight difference in the temperature. The ground returned through the leather as if it had been sitting somewhere cooler than the surface all day. The dry grass was thicker here. Even in the dark, the stems brushed his legs with more substance than anywhere else on the Crow place. More life. He crouched at the tree's base as he had the afternoon before. He pressed his palm down in the way Augusta had shown him, heel-flat fingers, relaxed, not pressing, but receiving. He held that for a long time. Then he did the other thing, the thing she'd taught him when he was small, the thing he'd thought was only for children until he got older and understood. She'd meant it with complete seriousness. He lay flat and pressed his ear to the ground. The motionless dark, the faint draw of warm air from the south, the wool of his shirt against cut grass. And then below it all so quiet that for the first 10 seconds he wasn't certain a presence, not a sound, not a vibration he could name with any word, a depth the kind of stillness that is its own form of speaking if you are quiet enough to receive it. Get very quiet and the ground will tell you. He lay there and let it tell him. It had water, not close, not easy, but down there patient and substantial and real in the way that only things that have been in place for a very long time are real. He got up, he took the spade from Tatum without ceremony and drove it into the earth 3 feet from the trunk on the southeast side where the grass had been darkest. The sound was different from the first moment. Not the tight, dense report of the corral ground, something with space inside it, a resonance that moved past the first strike, the tone of earth that was not solid all the way down. The soil came away in cohesive pieces, the crumble of ground that has held itself together around something slow and liquid below. There you are. Tatum worked beside him without commentary, which was its own form of trust. They dug until the moon had moved another hour, and then another. The hole reached their shins, then their knees. The soil darkened as they went deeper, not the pale caliche of the corral, but the actual mineral dark of earth that had been in conversation with water for a long time. The smell changed. That was what he'd been waiting for. Living ground carried its own signature, a faint organic depth like the underside of a flat stone lifted from a creek bed, something that breathed. Tatum paused once, straightened, pressed the back of his hand to the displaced soil. He looked at Silas. Silas nodded. They kept digging. When the gray of pre-dawn came, the hole was above their knees near mid-thigh on Tatum. Not enough, not nearly enough. Noon was maybe 5 hours out. Tatum looked at the sky. He drove the spade once more, turned the earth, then he stopped. If I'm not in the barn before Crow's morning round, he'll know. He set the spade against the rim. I can't help you from outside the gate if I'm already outside the gate. Silas understood. He took both handles. Nobody else will come, he said. Not a complaint, just the arithmetic of the situation. Tatum climbed out of the hole. He stood at the rim and looked down at Silas with the expression of a man who has considered something carefully and decided not to share his conclusions. He walked back toward the bunkhouse. The sky went from gray to the thin yellow of early morning. Silas dug. His shoulders had their own opinions. His lower back had entered negotiations he refused to acknowledge. He traded between spade and pick, reading the ground as he went, a layer of dense red clay that wanted the pick's edge, then a softer stratum beneath it that the spade could turn. The earth was getting colder with depth. Not cold from shade or air, cold from below conducted upward. He stopped, pressed his palm flat. Cool, the real mineral cool that only runs up from one source. He kept going. He was not aware of Roy Doss until the shadow crossed the rim. He looked up. Roy was standing at the edge, spare spade in hand, looking down with the expression of a man who has spent considerable time deciding something and has arrived somewhat reluctantly at a conclusion he means to honor. Tatum says you know what you're doing. Silas waited. Tatum doesn't say that about anybody. Roy climbed in. He took the spare spade and said nothing else, and didn't look at Silas again, just oriented himself to the available space and began to dig. The hole was narrow. 2 men made it complicated. They found a rhythm without discussing it, one driving while the other moved loose earth up and over the rim, and once the rhythm was found, it didn't need words to keep. 20 minutes later, Hale appeared at the rim. He looked down. His face ran its own arithmetic. He went away. He came back with the pick from the barn and dropped in without announcement. 3 men. Purvis came. stood at the rim a moment with his thumbs in his belt, turned and walked off, returned with his own spade and stepped in without a word. 4 men, 8 hands. The hole was wider now and deeper. The earth coming up was almost black, not wet, but holding the memory of something wet in its composition, the way ground does when it has sat above water for a long time and taken on its character. Chetfulk stood at the rim with his arms crossed. "You boys realize," he said, "that when this comes up, empty, every one of you is going to spend the rest of the year explaining yourselves to Headley Crow." Nobody responded. "Man walks in off nowhere, and here you all are digging his hole for him." He moved his gaze from one to the next, waiting for a face to acknowledge him. "Not one of you is going to have anything to stand on when this goes wrong." Roy kept his hands on the spade. Hela's shoulder moved, the pick came down. Purvis moved the earth. Chet watched a moment longer. He stepped back from the rim and spat, and moved 10 feet off where he stood with arms still folded, waiting. The cold came first. Experienced men in dry country knew it by instinct, that particular temperature rising from below, having nothing to do with shade or air movement, nothing to do with the hour of the morning, just the earth telling you what lived under it. Not quite a breath, an exhale, a long, patient exhale. Silas was at the bottom with the pick when he felt it come up through the soles of his boots. He stopped, pressed his toe flat to the earth pressed back, cold. He looked up. Hale had gone still. Purvis stood with his hands open, not touching anything. Roydos looked at the dirt between his feet and nodded once quietly, like a man confirming something he'd suspected, but hadn't been certain enough to say. Silas drove the pick. The earth came apart differently now. Where before it had fractured into hard plates, here it yielded with a texture. He recognized the crumble of soil that has spent a long time adjacent to water, releasing its compaction with a fine mineral dust that smelled of depth and cold stone and something clean. The scissor-tailed flycatcher found them before he saw it. That call, a sharp descending note, then a longer one, came from somewhere above the cottonwood. He looked up past the rim, the bird on the second lowest branch, the long forked tail hanging in the windless morning, absolutely still, one black eye angled down. He held its gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he drove the pick again. Hadley Crow arrived at 11:47. He did not arrive alone. He had, as Silas had counted on and not counted on, brought company, 3 neighboring ranchers, men with their own dry summers and their own failing wells, and the particular shared misery of a drought that had pressed everyone equally and left no one feeling charitable. They came in a loose group on horseback, and among them was the unmistakable atmosphere of a social occasion with a foregone conclusion. Nell Crow rode a little apart from her father, positioned the way she often was at the edge of his pronouncements. Crow came along the pasture track and saw the hole in the south fence line, and saw in it 4 of his own men. The conversation among the neighbors stopped. Crow's jaw moved through its familiar change from surprise, hardening into something that didn't need a name because it needed a response. He spurred toward the hole and came to a stop at the rim and looked down. "Get out of there!" Nobody moved. Silas looked up from the bottom. He had the pick in both hands, and his shirt was past saving, and the earth around his boots was the dark, heavy quality of ground that was very close to giving. "I said get out, all of you, right now." Roy Doss did not raise his eyes. "Hadley." Tatum Briggs' voice came from behind. He had come from the direction of the barn with the quiet exactness of a man who has been calibrating his timing. Wait, look at the color of that earth. He said it without drama. He said it the way a man says a true thing that requires only itself. Crow looked down. The earth at the bottom of the hole was very dark. Not the surface dark of watered soil, the dark of mineral certainty, the kind that comes from deep contact with sustained moisture over many years, the kind that a man who has worked this land for 3 decades might never have seen near the surface, because near the surface was not where it had been. He looked at it for 4 full seconds. Silas raised the pick. The blow landed flat and true, and the stone below gave with a sound that was not quite a crack, not quite a split, not quite the sound of something simply breaking, but all 3 at once, the sound of a long argument reaching its last word. The water came, not a seep, not a slow, cautious rise, feeling its way upward through disturbed soil. It came as if it had been making a case to come for a very long time and had been waiting for someone to make the necessary opening. It moved through the broken stone in a clean surge, cold the cold of aquifer water that has sat in rock and dark and stillness for years, and it was clear and it was real. Roy Doss took his hand off the spade. He crouched and put his hand in the rising water and stayed there. Halle said something that was more exhale than word. Purvis stood with his hat in both hands. One of the neighboring ranchers made a sound that was not quite a word, the sound of a man who has been looking for something for a long time and has just seen it. Roy climbed out of the hole and stood with the water still running from his hand down his wrist. He threw his hat in the air. It went up in a clean arc and came down in the dry grass, and nobody went to retrieve it. Chetfulk had taken 2 steps backward. The expression that had lived on his face for 2 days was gone. He was looking for a replacement, moving through candidates with the disoriented quality of a man whose primary audience, the part of him that had found all of this funny, had simply walked out of the room. Tatum Briggs closed his eyes. He stood with them closed for 3 full seconds, not moving in the stillness of a man arriving at the end of a long wait that had started well before this morning. Nell Crow had her hands at her chin. He did it. She said it quietly, but the yard had gone very quiet, and it carried. He actually did it. The water came up past Silas's ankles, filling the hole with the slow but absolute arithmetic of a pressure that had not had the chance to release in a very long time. He stood in it. He let it fill his boots. Above him at the rim, the living roots of the cottonwood spread outward from the base. The roots of a tree that had known this water was here, had always known, and had spent its life growing quietly toward it, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Silas looked up. Hadley Crow was still on horseback at the rim above him, looking at the water. He had not spoken a word. The permanent squint was still there. The jaw was set at its familiar angle, but something else had arrived in his face that had not been there before, and it had no simple name, not embarrassment exactly, not fury, though it held qualities of both. It was the expression of a man who has built himself into a certainty, who has lived comfortably inside that certainty for a long time, and who is now standing at the precise moment when that certainty is going to have to be made over from the ground up. He was very still. The 3 neighboring ranchers behind him were quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of men watching someone else's prediction fail. A different kind, the quiet of men running private arithmetic about their own land, their own dry draws, their own hands, who had dug the wrong places on someone's too confident word. None of them were laughing. The water kept rising, And Hadley Crow, who had filled every room he'd walked into for 30 years with the weight of his certainty, had nothing at all to say. The water was at Silas's shins when Hadley Crow finally found his voice. "Any hole that depth," he said. He said it to the general air, not to Silas, not to anyone in particular. "Dig far enough in this country, you'll find moisture somewhere. That's not skill, that's gravity." A man named Beckwith, who ran a spread 20 miles southeast and whose own crew had spent 40 days looking for a second source without result, turned his horse a quarter step. He looked at Crow with the particular expression of a man who has heard something he could let pass and has decided this once not to. "Hadley." He looked at the water rising in the hole with the patient self-evidence of a truth that had been underground a long time. "My boys have been working my south section since May, dry as chalk, every foot of it." He gathered his reins. "This man found this in a day, on land he'd never set foot on before. I wouldn't call that gravity." The silence that followed held the breath of 4 other men on horseback, running private arithmetic about their own land, their own wells, their own stubborn convictions about where to dig and who to ask. Crow said nothing. He dismounted and led his horse away from the rim without looking at anyone, and the quality of that departure, no instructions given, no ceremony, no final word, told Silas more than any speech could have. The opening attempt to walk it back had failed. The real negotiation would come later. It came that evening. Crow appeared at the south pasture with his hat on and his hands at his sides, in the posture of a man doing something he finds expensive and is not going to acknowledge the cost of openly. He stopped 2 feet from Silas and kept his voice low. "I'll give you good wages, water boss. You ride the land, you tell me what you find, we sink wells where you say. $1.50 a week, which is more than anyone here draws." He turned the hat brim with 2 fingers, that small displacement of energy. "But the other part, the part about speaking up in how this place is run, being heard like any other man." He paused. "That was said in heat. There are ways things are done here, and I don't think you came looking to change how a man runs his own land." The evening light ran long and level across the dry grass. "You said it to everyone," Silas said. "You said it loud, so it would be on the record. That was before you knew I was right." Crow stopped. The thing that moved through his face at that was not simple. Anger, yes, the reflexive resistance of a man who has not been interrupted cleanly in a long time. But underneath it, the specific discomfort of someone who has just heard an exact and correct thing and cannot find the counter-argument because there is none. "You're asking me to honor what you said when you thought it would cost you nothing," Silas said. "I'm asking you to honor it because it's what you said." Behind them, Nell had been crossing the yard carrying a pail, taking the long route back the way she sometimes did. She had stopped. She set the pail down. She walked to her father's shoulder and looked at him, not at Silas when she spoke, and her voice held the evenness of someone who has decided that the cost of what she is about to do is acceptable. "Everyone here was standing in that yard when you made the agreement. Every one of them heard it." She let a moment settle. "If your word only holds when it turns out to be easy to keep, it isn't a word. It's a preference." Crow looked at his daughter. She did not look away. He looked past her at the yard where the men who had dug that afternoon were finishing their day and very deliberately not watching. He had no way through this, the same quality of knowing that comes the moment a ledger count runs irrevocably the wrong direction. He looked back at Silas. All right, the words carried the texture of something that had held its shape a long time and had just been required to give. You stay, and you're heard. He took his horse by the bridle and walked toward the barn. He walked differently than he had a week before. Something had shifted in the set of his shoulders, not beaten, not diminished, but rebalanced the way a man moves when he has set down something he'd been carrying without knowing its weight. The news covered ground faster than it had any business doing. By the following morning, riders from neighboring properties had found reasons to come past the Crow fence line. By afternoon, men from town stood at the well rim, as if seeing it in person was required before the information could be trusted. They all had the same question eventually, and Silas gave it the same answer each time. My grandmother and my mother. Two women who knew more about this land than any man who ever dismissed them. The first time he said it, a hardware merchant from town looked at him with a bafflement that was not unfriendly. The second time, a young hand from a neighboring spread turned the information over quietly and said nothing. The third time, a woman who had come out with her husband, standing slightly back from the group, as women often did at such gatherings, straightened. Just slightly. Not a dramatic thing. The small particular movement of a person who has just heard something that reorganizes what had been previously arranged. He kept that note. There were people in every one of those groups who had a grandmother or a mother or an aunt whose knowing had been taken and used and returned without credit, and they had filed it in the cabinet where you keep the things you cannot address yet. When Silas said she knew first in the middle of the day, in front of men who expected the day to continue as it had something moved in that cabinet, he could not recover the original debt. He was clear about that. But he could say the name. He could say it out loud in daylight and watch the small rearrangement happen in the faces of the people who had been waiting without knowing they were waiting to hear it. He could do that much. 4 days after the water came in, Crow walked out to the well alone. He came without his horse, which was unusual. He came at first light before the ranch had started its day, and he was carrying his hat in his hand when he arrived. They stood at the rim. The water had settled clear and still 15 feet below, deep enough to hold cold, the kind of cold that came from somewhere far underground and arrived here as the end of a very long journey. I heard people my whole life, Crow said. He was looking at the water. I never once listened. I told myself they were the same thing. He turned the hat brim with both hands. They're not. Silas said nothing. My mother kept the books for this ranch before I took it over. Better than my father. Better than me, if I'm honest. Something tightened in his jaw and then deliberately released. He laughed at her when she tried to talk about the numbers at the dinner table. I sat there for 15 years with my eyes on my plate, and I swore I wasn't him. The morning had the thin, particular quiet of the panhandle before the wind decided what it was going to be. A shouting man never hears the water, Silas said. He said it without any edge to it. The true thing offered at the moment, it fit. Crow absorbed it. No, he said, he doesn't. My grandmother and my mother were right their whole lives, and most of the time it didn't matter. They found the water anyway, for men who went home with the credit. He picked up the measuring stick and held it in both hands, the way he sometimes held the willow rod, not to measure anything, just to have something grounded in his palms. The water didn't stop being there because the men wouldn't look. He set the stick aside. I'm not carrying any grievance toward you. That's not what this is." He met Crow's eyes, which was not easy for either of them. "But I'm going to keep saying what I see, and some days you're going to want me to stop. I'm asking you to let me finish anyway." Crow stood with that for a long time. "I can do that." He put his hat on and walked back toward the house, and the walk had in it something that had not been there before, the particular quality of a man who has just moved from one version of himself into a harder, more honest one, and is still deciding whether to be grateful for the occasion or merely to accept it. The harvest celebration came in late September, when the grass along the south fence had gone the color of old brass, and the cottonwood had shed half its leaves into the well water. Crow put tables in the yard and invited the county. Then he stood on the long bench that served as a speaking platform and said, "I've done most of the talking in this yard for 30 years. Today, the man who should have been heard from the first day he walked through that gate is going to speak, and I am going to be quiet." He stepped down. He looked at Silas. He gestured toward the bench. Silas had not prepared anything. He had known the occasion was coming, but the words he had were the kind that either arrived when needed or didn't arrive at all. He stepped up. The yard was full Crow's hands, neighboring ranchers and their families, people from town who had come as much for the food as for any other reason. He looked across all of it and understood in the weight of those waiting faces that this moment would not come twice. "I didn't find that water," he said. The yard went quiet enough to hear the cottonwood. "I found what my grandmother saw before I was born, and what my mother showed me with her own hands when I was 6 years old, out in a field that wasn't much different from this one." He held that for a moment. Neither of them ever had a day like today. Nobody set them on a bench and asked them to speak. Nobody thanked them in public in the daylight with people watching. He let it sit. They spent their lives knowing more than the men who moved them aside, and they did the work anyway because the work was true and because the cattle needed water regardless of whose hand the credit went to. He found Tatum Briggs at the back of the gathering, where Briggs would stand present, not claiming anything. This man was the first one who listened. He stood in front of his employer and declined to step back, and he carried a pick in the dark. For a stranger he had no obligation toward, because he recognized something, not a trick, not luck, a knowing that had been right for 2 generations before it got to me. He held Tatum's gaze. If there's water on this ranch, it runs through his willingness to hear what nobody else would. Tatum looked at the ground. "There are people standing in this yard right now," Silas said, "who carry something they've been told isn't worth saying, something that was laughed off or handed to someone else, or buried in the particular silence that gets kept at the dinner table when the wrong person has the right answer." He did not raise his voice. He had no need to. "I want to tell you something that took me 26 years and one serious mistake to understand." He looked down at the earth beneath the bench, then back up. "The water was there before I pointed to it. It was there before my grandmother held the rod over it in the dark and walked home without saying a word. It was there before the first man on this land decided he knew better than the woman beside him." He paused. "The land doesn't argue, it just holds what it holds, and it gives its water to the one who gets quiet enough to ask." He stepped down. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then the sound came, not sudden, but gathering the way water gathers before it moves, beginning at the edges and finding its way forward, until it was everywhere at once, and had in it the quality of something that had been needed, and had now finally arrived, and would not easily be taken back. Crow was in the front. He began to clap. slowly, deliberately, the way a man keeps a promise in public when he has made it impossible to keep it privately. Near the back of the gathering, a woman who had not clapped immediately was looking down at the small girl beside her. She said something too quiet to carry over the sound. Then she crouched to the child's level and took her hand, and she began to talk. The evening came the way late September evenings came on the Llano Estacado, without announcement, the light going from gold to amber to something thinner and more honest, the wind settling to nothing, the wide sky holding its last color past the point where the ground had given up on warmth. Silas waited until the others had moved toward the tables, and the food and the pleasant noise of people given a reason to feel something. He walked to the well. The cottonwood held its remaining leaves with the loose grip of a tree that has done its work for the season and has no argument with what comes next. The grass around the rim had gone the color of pale fire. The water below was dark and still and quiet, and held the last of the sky in it, the way you hold something you intend to keep. He reached into his vest pocket. He held it the way he always had, thumb running along the fork, finding the place where the wood divided. Augusta's hands had made it smooth, and then his hands had continued what hers started, and there was no telling any more where one set ended and the other began. He crouched at the rim and set the rod down in the grass at the edge of the well, at the base of the cottonwood's exposed root. Gently, the way you set down something that has carried more than its weight. The evening held it. Then the scissor-tailed flycatcher came from the half-bare branches above that long forked tail, trailing behind it the pale rose of its flanks, catching the last light, making one unhurried arc, and it landed on the rim, 6 inches from the willow rod. It stood there and looked at the water below with the absolute attention of a creature that has no interest in the social requirements of the moment. Then it looked at Silas. He looked back. The last orange line of the sun pressed itself flat against the western horizon. The smell of cooling earth came up around him, red dust, dry grass, and beneath everything the clean mineral cold of water from deep underground, carrying itself upward into air that had been asking for it all summer. The sound the cottonwood made was the sound of a few remaining leaves in a breath of wind, too small to feel on skin, a sound like people who know each other well enough to say the difficult things speaking very quietly among themselves. 3 generations had marked this ground. Finally, one of them had lived to see the water rise. He pressed his palm flat to the earth at the well's edge, heel down, fingers open, not pressing, but receiving exactly as Augusta had shown him in a field east of here, when he was young enough that everything she showed him was simply the shape of the world. He felt the cool come up through his palm. He felt the depth. The bird lifted off the rim and went higher than the cottonwood, higher than the last of the light, that forked tail opening against the empty sky in 2 directions at once. And then it was gone, and the sky above the Llano Estacado was simply the sky holding nothing back and nothing in reserve, the same for everyone beneath it. The willow rod lay in the grass at the well's edge. The water lay below. The evening moved across the plain the way it always had, not asking whether the land beneath it was ready, not waiting for permission. It arrived, because this was its hour. It had always been its hour. In the weeks that followed, the woman who had crouched down to her granddaughter at the back of the gathering began teaching the girl what she had kept to herself for 30 years. She had held it in silence because there had been no occasion to say it out loud. Now the occasion had been made. Silas rode out to 3 ranches where the wells had begun to fail, and he walked those lands and found what they held and said, where it had come from each time, not instinct, not luck, 2 women, and what they handed on. He heard some months later that one of the men at the celebration had gone home and for the first time genuinely listened to what his wife had been trying to tell him about their south pasture for 2 years. He heard that she had been right. He was not surprised. A man who shouts never hears the water. But the inverse was also true, and it was the more hopeful half of the same sentence. The moment you stop shouting, the ground begins. If there is someone in your life who carried a knowing the world wasn't ready to hear, who pointed at the right place and was moved aside, who found the water and handed the credit to the room, we'd be glad to hear about them in the comments. The wells that were found, the things that were built, the right answers that arrived through the wrong doors, those names deserve to be said out loud. And if this story reached someone tonight who needed it, pass it along. We'll be here for the next one.